It's gonna be so hard doing this review about saying city too many times. Welcome back to Levity Books. My name is Liam and I hope you've been reading well. Today we're talking about The City and the City by Miéville, and never before have I seen a book defy genre so boldly. The cover of the book says that it's a contemporary crime thriller, but the many awards of this book say that it's a sci-fi fantasy story. The author calls it weird fiction, which is a blend of fantasy and horror. But what The City and City actually is a detective story about a murder that happens between two interwoven yet divided cities. In this story, it is illegal for the citizens of the two cities, Basel or Ulcoma, to even look at the other city or to traverse into the other city. But the story is about the citizen of one city being found dead in another. So the mystery is, how was the body found out of bounds without any report of there being what is called a breach or moving from one city to the other? Overall, the plot at the beginning of the story is really good. I was thinking this might be a 4 or 5 star read because it's so fast, the world is so vast, and there's so much complexity to it that it really does get you excited for the story ahead. But unfortunately, some readers are going to be put off by the way this story pans out. Ultimately, the characters are just not emotionally engaging enough to really have a good impact with the reader, and there are some unresolved plot elements which will bug some readers more than others. Me personally, I prefer detective stories which allow the reader to do some detecting themselves and have very paranoid themes about who exactly is the culprit. Whereas here, there's not enough detecting. I found more activity in reading, for example, The Hounds of the Baskervilles by Sherlock Holmes, where you have multiple suspects and you're trying to piece together all the evidence in your head. Whereas in this story, it's very continuously, things are happening so fast and so continuously that there's never this time for you to sit back and reflect and think who really did it and why did this happen on a very deep level. And that's a part that I didn't miss. But if you're someone who really likes thrillers and really an engaging and complex plot, then you'll really like this. I think the defining feature of whether you will love this book is whether you like science fiction narratives, plot-heavy narratives with very complex, thrilling plot events, but less on character, because there's not a lot of feeling in this book. So if you like character-driven novels, this will probably fall a little flat for you. The story here is so unemotional that the TV adaptation took great liberty with the plot and made the detective, Inspector Borlu, who's the main character solving the crime, they gave him an ex-wife he's also trying to find to make the case more personal. And I kind of don't want to watch it for that reason, because I think that changes the story so much that I don't think I would be seeing the brilliance of this book in that. Although, in fairness, I think there was a need for that, and I think that maybe if this story was put in a more of an emotional context, it would have wider appeal. I think there are cultural comments made by this author who's very politically active, and I just want to briefly address what I think they are here. So the first thing is the city of Basel and Ulcoma, the way that they're these two cities occupying the same landmass, interwoven yet distinct, is, I think it's very much like the Israel-Palestine conflict, in that you have this landmass occupied by rival factions, and if you breach into one place, then it's suddenly illegal. There's a lot of hostility that is the result of these distinctions of the identity of the land. It seems like a fantasy element when you read it, but I don't think it has to be, and which is why I think it is a commentary on political conflicts in the world. I think another conflict he is talking about is between the original owners of a landmass and the new inhabitants, because the student who was found dead, who is the murder victim of the story, was a Canadian citizen who was an archaeologist, and I think there might be something to be said about how Canadians and First Nations people interact. He might be saying that not only is there a struggle to define a landmass between political entities like the Basil and Ulcoma, but it's also that the founders of the country, do they have their identity? Like, does the city belong to the first people who find it, or to the people who win the current war? The role of archaeology in the novel could also be a reference to a work by Michel Foucault, the thinker. The archaeology of knowledge is where he proposes that socio-cultural constraints of thought and language control how we perceive the world, and that's very true of the citizens of the two cities here, in that they don't see, they'll see a place, and one city will say that it's called this, and another city will say it's called that. So language is controlled by the citizens in the story. So I think he's introducing very intellectual, academic frameworks into this crime novel with science fiction elements. So it's very bizarre. It's a very bizarre read. So even just for its originality, this book is really important. It's really powerful, and you can see why he won so many awards for it, because it's just so unusual. The book's title could also be an absurdist joke about language, because it's a city which is two cities which might be another secret city. It's like, how can one be more than one? I think it's not clear that it's humorous in the novel. There's not really that much humor in this book, but when you analyze it, it's very absurd in a kind of in the way that maybe Kafka's work is absurd. The jokes aren't really that funny. They're just kind of but unlike writers of labyrinthine plots like Calvino or Borges, I don't think Miéville takes it far enough. It seems like for 320 pages, somehow the plot goes on too long, and these really cool themes about the sociocultural constraints of language and how we perceive things, and also just the plot itself, so interesting. It doesn't seem to go far enough. It seems like it's trying to do too many things at once, and I think that's why I'm going for a 3-star of this. It's too sparse in its scope and its depth to be really, really enjoyable. It's like a strange hybrid. So the story seems to be many things at once. Not enough of one thing for me to strongly recommend it, but enough of a lot of things for me to lightly recommend it to anyone who likes a good crime story that just keeps going and keeps going and keeps taking you somewhere you don't even know where it's going, really. The reason I read this was because Disco Elysium takes clear inspiration from it. It's cited as a reference, and the opening really does remind me of a written version of Disco Elysium. There are some small changes, obviously, but the murder is in a rundown neighborhood with delinquents at the crime scene, and the case is very difficult. The detective seems to keep struggling, but slowly make some progress, and the murder itself seems to have caused a lot of socio-political tension between local groups, I guess you could call it. In this case it's cities. In Disco Elysium it's more political factions. However, I think Disco Elysium's story moved me more because there's just more of a psychological backstory to the detective, more companionship between the detective's partners, there's greater lore to the environment, and there's just more fun and absurdity to it. There's absurdity here, but everything's quite serious. There's not too many jokes. There was some corny Arnold Schwarzenegger joke, but let's not get into that. So reading this book has only convinced me that Disco Elysium's narrative is at least as strong as contemporary novels, and the parts that I really resonated with in Disco Elysium aren't really from this book. The setup which makes the game work is from this book, but the actual unexpected fun elements of Disco Elysium are outside of this story. So in conclusion, China Miéville himself says that he writes weird fiction, and this is a very strange book, but it's very interesting because of that, because not much in contemporary fiction is really pushing boundaries like this is, in a way that's accessible to a lot of people. So that's all for now. Happy reading!